We should always start off by planning it out properly first. To do this, we can first determine what the required functionalities are for this app, and then group those functionalities into pages. Then we need to determine what the links are between those pages. Only after doing this should we begin to actually create the application and add the required elements and data sources to power those elements with the right data, and finally, add the actions that power the functionality of navigation, creating records, updating records, or deleting them. Based on what we just went over, let's determine what pages might be required for this application. A login page is the clear first required page, so that users may authenticate. After authenticating, we need to take the user to a home page. We'll call this page Risk Management. The first obvious page after this is a details page for the risks, where we can list all the parameters of a risk as well as list the associated assessments and mitigation plans. We'll then also need pages to list the details of those assessment risks and mitigation plans, and when we click on them too. Finally, we'll need pages to add data. This entails pages for adding new risks, risk assessments, and mitigation plans. Now that we know the pages, let's work out what data we would need for these pages, and also globally. Globally, there are instances of certain data that we can share between all pages that will make our lives easier instead of recreating those data sources each time for every page. Those being the risks by category, assessments for risks, and mitigation plans for risks. After that, we can look at risk management. This will require the all registered risks, risk by impact and likelihood, risks that need reassessment, and mitigation plans beyond due date. The risk details page will simply need to get a single record for that risk detail. The add new risk page also will just get a single risk. Assessment details will get a single record for that assessment. Add new assessment will get a single risk also, but it will also get the assessment scores. The mitigation details page will require a single record for the mitigation, and add new mitigation will also require a single risk record. Now that we have a good outline for our app, we can begin building it. We'll start by creating all the pages we mentioned and setting up their settings. To start off, let's create a new application and give it a name. We can then just remove all the pages, so we're starting with a blank slate. We'll create our new page for login, and we'll keep the path to just dash so that this is our home page. We'll then create our new page for risk management, another new page for our registered risk details, a new page to add a new risk, our assessment details page, and finally, the add new mitigation plan page. We can now go into the page properties for all of these pages that we've created and change our visibility settings, as we want these only to be available to logged in visitors. You'll note that this icon appears next to these pages where this has been changed. We'll now just do this for all the pages. Now that that's done, we can move on to the next task. The first thing we can do is set up our user authentication. We can do this by accessing the settings of our app, navigating to the users section, and adding a user source. We'll do this through adding the type of the Baserow table authentication, the integration to our local Baserow instance, and we'll just keep the name to employees. We'll then select the database we want to work off and the table. We'll select which email field represents the email, and same for the name field. And for role, we'll select the job role. We also want the authentication to happen over email and password combination, so we'll select the password field here. And that's it. We've set up our user authentication for the app. Let's start adding our data. In our planning phase, we realized that we needed 3 pieces of data globally. And that was our risks by category, assessments for risk, and mitigation plan for risks. So let's add this data in now. We're going to go to the Data tab. We're going to say Add a new data source. We're going to select what we want to do here, the action, and we're going to list multiple rows. We're then going to use the local base row. We're going to call this risks by category. We're going to create that, and now we're going to select the database that this is going to come from. We only have one database, so that makes it a lot easier. We're going to select the table risk categories, and we're going to leave it to all categories as the view. We're going to click Save on this, and we're going to say Share between pages. Let's now create our assessment for risks. We're going to list multiple rows, assessments for risk. I'm going to select our database, risk assessments, all assessments. We will need to add a filter to this one later, but for now we can't do it because we do not have the page parameter set. So we're just going to save this as it is for now. And we're also going to share this between pages. Let's go ahead and create our last data source for this page. We're going to list multiple rows again. This one's going to be our mitigation plan for risks. We're going to set our database. We're going to set our table. And we're going to set our view to all mitigation plans. Again, this one's going to require a filter later, but we can't set it yet. So let's continue again. And we're going to set this to share between pages. Now that we have these three set up, we can start setting up our data sources for individual pages. Let's begin doing that. Let's begin with the risk management page, where we're going to set up several data sources. Let's add a new data source. We're going to make this one list multiple rows. And this is going to be our risks by impact and likelihood. We'll create that, select our database, our table, and we'll select all scores here. We'll click Save. We'll then set up our new one. Again, going to be list multiple rows. We're going to call this all registered risks. And we're going to set all our registrations here. Our third data source we're going to need is also going to be list multiple rows. And it's going to be risks that need reassessment. And here we're going to say registrations that require reassessment. That's the specific view. Our last data source that we're going to need is also a list multiple row, and it's going to be mitigation plans beyond the due date. We'll create that, select our database and table, and here we're going to select the correct view for this data and click Save. Moving on to the next page, registered risk details. We're going to set up the data source for this page. But before we do that, we actually have to add a page parameter that we're going to use for these data sources for filtering. We'll do that by accessing our page settings. At the end of the page settings here, I'm going to add an extra slash. I'm going to add a semicolon, and I'm going to write ID. I'm going to change this from text to numeric, and I'm going to click Save. That's going to add this ID parameter to our path. Perhaps to make it a bit clearer, I'm going to just change this from ID just to risk ID, so it's more obvious what we're looking at. Now we can move ahead and start creating our data source for this page. We're only going to need the one, and this one is going to be getting a single row. We're going to be getting a single risk detail, and because it's a single row, it's going to need a row ID. And that's where the page parameter is going to come into use. So here we can see the parameter that's available, which is risk ID. We're going to select that here. And that data is going to be sent to this page when navigating to it. So it'll become available for this data to be filtered on. We're going to click Save. And that's our risk details set up. Moving on to the next page, we're going to go to Add a new risk. And we're going to add another piece of data here, and it's going to be a single row, going to be a single risk, We're going to go to our risk registrations, all registrations. And here we're just going to actually hard code in the value 1. We're a little bit indifferent about which row ID we need because we're just going to be using this to populate some items, some elements in our page. So we're going to click Save here, and this will make sense later in the video. Next, on to assessment details. We're going to add a new data source here too. This one is also going to be get a single row. We're going to call it get a risk assessment detail. We're going to select risk assessments here, and we're going to need another page parameter for this. This is not a problem because we can actually just save this for now and we'll come back to it. We're going to add a new page parameter here. In fact, let's just add 2 because we're going to need both of them. And that's our assessment ID and our risk ID. I'm going to click Save. I'm going to go back to our data source. I'm going to edit it. And here now I can select the risk ID. Apologies, that should be the assessment ID, of course. And we're going to click Save. The next one will be Add New Assessment. For this one, we're going to need another page parameter, which is going to be our risk ID as a numeric parameter. Once we've added that, we can add our data sources, which is going to be, our first one is get risk. So we're going to get a single row. We're going to say get risk, create that, select our data, and we're going to select risk ID for what we're filtering it by, and we're going to click Save. And the second one that we're going to need is going to be multiple rows, going to be get assessment scores. We're going to use the risk assessment scores table, and we're going to get all the scores there. Moving on to the mitigation plan details page, we're going to need another data source here. And that, of course, is going to be another single row. So we're going to actually need another page parameter. So let's first add that. And this one is going to be our plan ID. And it's going to be numeric. We'll save that. We can add our source, which is going to be get a single row. Going to be the plan details. We're going to select our settings here. So, of course, it's going to be mitigation plans. We're going to select all mitigation plans, and then we're going to filter by that plan ID. We click Save, and that's going to complete our data source for this page. Last but not least, our final page, we're going to need, again, a risk ID here. Set numeric, save it. We can then add our final data source, which is going to be a single row. It's going to be a get risk. Then create that risk assessment, risk registrations, all registrations, and filter by that parameter. That concludes all the data sources for our app for now. We may come across ones that we may need to add in later in case our planning hasn't accounted for it yet. Now the real fun begins, where we can start building out the front end UI of our app. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to start on our login page, and we're going to create our first element, which is going to be a multi-page header. After adding that, we're going to first create the settings necessary for this, and we're going to exclude selected pages. Add our first element inside this. It's going to be a column element, which is going to be 2 columns, and we're going to vertically align the content within it. We'll add text element to the left side column. We're going to say this is logged in as, add some stars here, some asterisks to highlight this, and we're going to select the username to be loaded dynamically. And after that, we're actually going to also just load in the role of that user dynamically too. Alright, we're going to add a button. This is going to be our logout functionality, so we'll write in the logout. We'll also change the styling of this to align it on the right-hand side. We're going to set the event for onClick to be logout. And now that we have that, we can go ahead and add header image above our columns. So we're going to add image here. We're going to upload. select the file that we want to add as our header image, upload it, and add it in. Now that we have that, let's just test our dynamic data in this text field by actually just viewing this as one of our logged in users. So if I select Ali Edgar as the first one here, we'll see that it loads in the data dynamically that we wanted. So when Ali logs in, this is what she'll see. Likewise, when someone else logs in, they'll see their information. Now, one thing to point out, with the asterisks that I've added in here, it's actually marked down. We use asterisks for bold. Now, because this is the login page, we're actually not going to be showing this header here. That's why we have excluded from this page. So we're going to have to basically recreate this header in a very minimal function here. So we're going to add the image again. Upload that same image. We'll then add in and we'll make this the title of our app. And let's just center that in the middle of the page. And what we can also do to that is we can change the color of the font, but I'm going to just leave it as the default right now. The next thing we're going to want to add to the page is a login form. So we can just select login form there. We'll select the employees as the user source. And for the button, we can just change that from login to sign in. Now we can take this one step further by adjusting the theme overrides here and adding different visuals. But maybe we'll do that at the end of this app. Very basic. The last thing we want to do with this login form is that we want to create an event, and that's the event that's going to occur after the user logs in. And we could simply just make this a navigation action, and we're going to navigate to the risk management page. And we're going to do so in the same tab. And that's our login functionality already fixed. With that finished, we can actually move on to our next page, which is going to be our risk management page. We'll notice that when we navigate to this page, we already have our multi-page header, because that's going to be on every page except for the login page that we defined not to include it in. So let's begin building out our page. I think the first element that we can start with is just going to be a heading element. So we can define which page we're on. And we're going to say that this is the registered risks summary page. And we can then move on to add our next element, which is going to be a columns element. It's going to be 3 columns this time. And we're going to keep the vertical alignment at default. We're then going to first add our first table on the left here. And this table is going to be our risks by category. And then we're going to refine what we want to see here. So we don't need to see our risk registrations. So we're going to remove this column. And we don't need to see our description. So we'll remove that too. Now we'll rename this one to category. And we will rename this to registrations. We can then add our second table, which is going to be a risks by impact and likelihood. And again, here we want to define the tables that we're going to be using. So here we'll keep the name and we'll remove these other fields, only leaving the count impact. Also, the symbol would be nice to have, but I have an idea what we can do there. We can actually go back to the name. We're going to rename this to impact. And before we do the data name source, we're going to use the symbol and then followed by the name. And then for the impact, we're just going to rename this to registrations. Now that we have our impact sorted out, we also want to add our likelihood. So instead of recreating all of this, I'm just going to duplicate it. And I'm going to send it over to the final column. And now we're just going to change impact for likelihood. Now, instead of this being for count impact, we're going to do count likelihood. And that final table completed now too. Being our main page, we're going to want to add some additional data and metrics here, or just information that's going to be useful. And I think a good one for that is going to be adding something for urgent tasks. So we're going to add this, and we're just going to update this to urgent tasks. And after we've done that, we're going to follow it up again with the columns, but this time we'll only be using 2, and we'll keep it at the default settings. Now let's start off on the left here by adding a text item, and we're going to add some details for reassessment of following risks. And underneath that, we're going to add a table again. And that table is going to be the risks that need reassessment. There it is. And here we're going to just start deleting the columns that we don't need again. We'll need assessment frequency and the last assessment date, but the rest we don't need. Now what we want to do is we want to actually go into our settings for our fields, and we're going to change this to a link type. We're going to set that back to the name. And what we're going to do is we're going to navigate to registered risk details. And we want to send our risk ID page parameter with that. And that's going to be the ID. And to spruce things up a little bit here, what we can also do is adjust our assignment frequency, not just to be this, but to be tags. And then inside the color, we're going to make this a formula. And we're going to again take the color there and add that in. On the right-hand side, we're going to add a text item. And this time, we're going to do it for incomplete mitigation plans beyond the due date. And again, underneath that, we're going to set up a table. This table is going to be for our mitigation plans beyond the due date data source. And again, we're going to keep the name and remove other fields that we don't want to see. The due date we want and the status we want, but maybe we want that above the due date. Let's delete the rest. And likewise here, we're going to change this into a link. And we want it to link to our mitigation plans details. And for that, we're going to be sending the plan ID, which is the ID of the record that we're clicking. Again, for status, we're going to use tags to make this look a bit visually pleasing, setting the color to the formula, and that completes this table too. What we may also want to do is allow our users to interact with this data, and we can define how they do that through the user actions panel here. For example, I might want them to be able to filter by the name, sort by the name, and search by the name. And even for fields that aren't visible, you can actually still make them searchable. So if they were to search for something that was inside the keyword of description, that record would still show up. And for example, for assessment frequency, or rather this one, maybe we can do due date here and for sorting, and we want to filter by the status and sort by the status. And then for this one, we can do something similar. We can enable all three for the name, search for the description, assessment frequency, we can filter and sort by, and then last assessment, we can only sort by. By adding these settings, it gives our users the ability to perform these actions in the app based for these tables specifically. Finally, let's add one last section to this page. And we're going to do this by going to our columns and adding a new text underneath again. Or, sorry, not a new text. We want to actually add a header. So let's add the header. And that header is going to be overview of registered risks now. And underneath this, we can add some text that we're going to turn into a link. In fact, we don't need to even add it as text then. We can just add it as a link. So let's do that instead. We'll add here and add a link. And this link is going to enable the person to register a new risk. So let's give it the text of register new risk. And it's going to have navigate to the add new risk page. And it's going to do that in the same tab. And instead of it having it as a button, we're just going to keep this as a link. So it's more subtle in our design. After that, we're going to add a repeat element. Now the repeat element is going to repeat the data and all the elements inside of it, depending on the record that it's displaying. And because it needs to repeat items from a data source, we need to select that data source here. So this will be our all registered risks data source. And now we can start adding elements within this repeat element. And we'll again start off with the column. Going to be 2 columns. On the left here, we're going to just add some text to say legal dispute. And on the right here, we're going to add a link. We're going to say details. And this one is going to navigate to the registered risk details. And of course, we're going to use the ID of the data source for that. And this time, we'll make it a button and we'll adjust this to show on the right-hand side. Now, maybe to make this stand out a little bit more as a header, what we're going to do is we're going to firstly vertical align this also, and then we're going to adjust the styling of this column. And maybe for this, we're going to change the background to a color background. And we're going to use this color here, or we'll just select one because I've got too many here. So AAC, that should be good. And maybe it's a little bit too dark. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to adjust the transparency down to about 30%. And that looks a little bit better now. You can see that it's repeating here because it's repeating for every time there's a record. And because I find that a bit distracting for myself in the UI, I'm going to actually just go back to the repeat item and I'm just going to temporarily disable repetitions so that I don't have to see that. And just looking at our item we've created here, I can see that this is a little bit hugging the left border here. So we're going to go into the style and we're going to change the padding here to be 20 pixels. I'm going to do the same for this one, but on the right side. And now they're not hugging the corners again. Underneath this, we'll start adding more details to our items. So we're going to add another column. It's going to be 3 columns this time. And here we're going to add, let's see, we'll add a text column first. And we'll call this description. We'll duplicate this and put it to the next one. We'll duplicate it again and put it into the next one. And these are going to be our headers. And this one we're going to add as category. And this one will make, oops, I don't know why that did not update. So this one will be category. And this one will be status. Now that we have that, we'll add an item beneath that, also text, and we're going to have the data source description here. We'll just duplicate this actually here. And here we will change this to be our data source category value. And again, for status, we're going to make this come from status and the value of that. But maybe there's not enough visual difference between these. So what I want to do actually is go into the description here and change the font 12. And maybe we'll make this a slightly more gray text to differentiate it. just going to copy the value that I used here because I'm going to make the same change to all our headers here. And for some reason that did not copy, so I'm just going to go in there again and we'll do the same last. And now that's looking a lot better. What we can also do here is maybe we can add a margin into our styles here so that there's a little bit of an indent from the left side. After that, we can go back to our columns and we'll add another text here. And this one, we're going to make the last assessment. And actually, instead of doing that, I'm going to actually make it the same as this and format it. So let's go to the styling again, 12, and let's get that color again that we used. Oops. Add that here. And underneath this, we'll add the last assessment date. So here would be the data source, last assessment date. Let's finalize this by adding a bit more information here, and we'll do so in columns. Again, this time we'll select 5 columns, even though we're not going to use maybe all 5. I just want to make them smaller, so I've selected 5 to make each column a little bit smaller in width. And then from there, I'm going to add a text item. I'm going to make this the data source impact, and I'm going to use Markdown to make it bold. And then I'm going to add another text item beneath it. Get rid of that. I'm going to use the symbol. And now what I want to do is I'm just going to duplicate this, send it over that way, duplicate this, send it over that way, and bring it underneath that. And instead here, I'm going to make this the likelihood. And likewise, here this needs to be the likelihood symbol. And maybe the last thing we want to see is another text item here. And what I'm going to add as here is this entire score. And again, we're going to select Markdown to make that bold. And maybe actually we can have this a little bit bigger than the rest because it's looking a little bit small and lost there. So we're going to increase that to 16. In fact, let's make it 18. And I think that pretty much concludes everything I want to add on this page. Just to be sure that everything's working as I intended it, I'm going to disable this setting again and make sure that everything's repeating as I would expect it to repeat. And here we can see that it's doing it and the data is changing for everything that we want to see there. So that's great. So with that finished, we can move on to our registered risk details page. To speed things up, instead of adding every element individually, I'm going to review pages that are already fully created just to show what elements have been added and how they've been set up. On the registered risk details page here, you can see, of course, we start with our multi-page header. We then can see that the next item in our list is a columns element, which holds just this single button here, which is a link. And that's going to just go to our risk management page, which is our home button. Following on from that, we again start with some columns. This time, we're holding in just some information about a data breach and giving the person the ability to register a new risk. This link is going to go to the Add New Risk page. From there, we've got this extra column here, which holds all our elements for creating a form manually. Here, we're using a selection of the choice elements, a record selector element, as well as a data input element. This form data is then available to be used in an event. So for example, if we go to the events of this now, we can see that there's an update a row event, and we can see that this is getting filled in from the form data. So here we have the source, the status, the category, the assessment frequency, and the estimated cost, each being used in their relative fields to assign the data for that. And the ID of the row is getting updated based on the risk ID that's being used in the page parameter. We can also see that all of these fields or elements are getting their data brought in dynamically from which record we're currently on. The same can be said about these items here, as well as the tables that we're going to see and look at below. Now, just to point out quickly, if we want to see that these dynamic data are being brought in properly, we can change the record ID at the top of the page here. And that should then, in theory, give us all the data behind that record. One important thing to note with our events with this form is after we've updated the row, we also create another action, which is refreshing the data source. And we're going to refresh the data source that populates this page. And that's important because that data has been updated with the updated row. And unless you refresh the data source, that data will be stale and it won't show the updated data that you've just changed. Moving on from there, we can see that we have two tables at the bottom of this page. And we also have columns that have links to create new assessment and create new mitigation plans. Of course, each pointing to their relevant pages. The first table is our assessments for risk table, which is actually getting filtered by the parameter of the page ID. And that's why we could see that this was updating when we changed the record also. The second table is coming from our mitigation plan for risks, again, being updated by the record ID. So we can see that again. If I update to number 4, we'll see that the mitigation plans update alongside the record. Just like any detail page, everything here is set up to be dynamically generated based off the record ID. That's about it for the registered risk details page. Let's take a look at the add new risk page now. Moving on to the add new risk page, we can see our standard multi-page header as well as our column here to send us back to the home page. We then give it a header to say what we're going to be doing, and we then move on to a very basic form. Inside this form, we have several elements. We can first put a plain text here where we can just say who the registrant is, and that's just going to load in the user data of the user who's currently logged into the system. We then move on to a data input where we're going to name the risk, the description, another data input for the cost, and then we'll move on to our record selector, which is going to pull in the records from the risks by category data source. We then have a choice option, which is getting populated dynamically by the data here, where we can see that the option names come from get a risk and source. And the option values come from available options, get a risk and source. So they're both coming from the same thing, except this comes from the value and this comes from the ID. The next one is another choice element, which is the status. And finally, we have a assessment frequency choice option too. Moving back to the top layer here, which is the form element, we can then go onto the events tab to see what events are getting created by this form. Now, because this is adding a new risk, we're going to want to create a row. And with that, we're going to update the risk registrations table with this data. That'll load in all the data all the fields inside this table. And if you're not using any of those fields, it's important to note that you can just instead disable this field, in which case that data is not going to be sent. We're then populating all of the field data with dynamic data from the form that's being filled in here. So we can see that the name of the risk is coming from the form data name of the risk. This is just your standard form creation. And after the create a row action has been taken, another action is added or event that's called open page. And we're going to redirect the user back to the registered risk details page with the risk ID of what we've just created. So that's going to take us back to this page over here, and it's going to populate the paid parameter with the ID of what we've just created here. That sums up the add risk page. Let's take a look at assessment details. Of course, we start again with the usual familiar elements. After moving from that, like any details page, we want to just list the details of whatever record or records we're looking at on this page. Assessment details is a very special page because it's actually got two page parameters, which if we look at the page settings, we can take a look that the first one is the assessment ID and the second is the risk ID, both of them being numeric, of course, being identifiers for the records. If we take a look at what we have here, we can see that we're looking at record 1, which is the assessment ID, and risk ID 1. That's important to note because they need to match. So here we're looking at a data breach assessment, and we want to see all assessments for data breach. So it's got to be the same number here in order to be relatable. We don't want to, for example, see something here for data breach assessment, but then we're looking at something that's different for the employee misconduct assessments. So these records need to reflect each other, and we can see that needs to be the case. If we look, for example, at something like this, we can see that fire hazard assessment needs to match for all assessments for fire hazard because this is being loaded dynamically. Now that we know that, it's important that we can see what we're doing on this page. So here we're just loading in the data for the record on the page. But more importantly, we want to be able to update this data. So again, we have a form here that's going to update our findings. On this event, we're going to be updating this row, and this row is obviously getting loaded in by the page parameter. We're then only updating the form data for findings. We're not updating anything else, so they are all disabled. And then, of course, like always, if we're updating a row, we're also refreshing the data source after that so that our page content is always up to date and doesn't become stale. And then underneath, we have a secondary table that's going to be listing the relevant records for what we're looking at in the assessment ID. And we're doing that with also a way to kind of make this recursive. So if you're on the same page for data assessment 1, for example, and you want to take a look at data assessment 2, you could click this, which means that the title needs to be a link. And that link is going to navigate back to the exact same page with the data source ID and the risk ID being the page parameter. So the assessment ID is getting updated to change what we see here, but the risk ID is remaining the same. Of course, that's all that is entailed for this page to show the details of what we want to see. But of course, the next fundamental item that we're going to want to do is to be able to create new assessments. And we're going to do that through the Add New Assessment page. Moving directly onto Add New Assessment, we're going to be looking at exactly what we basically saw at Add New Risk. We're going to have a form element, which is going to have multiple items inside the form, which is going to create the data that we need dynamically to create the record that we want to create. So like the Add New Risk, we have this form and we have several elements here, including data input, a date time picker, a data input again, more specifically one that is being selected as multi-line. And then we also have a record selector that comes from the impact and the likelihood record selector, so we can select which likelihood this assessment has. From there, we can go back to our form element here, and we can see the events that are getting created. Of course, we have to create a row event, which is going to create a new record in the risk assessments table, and all the relevant details of that record are coming from this form. Just like the Add New Risk page, once a record has been created, it's going to be followed up by another action, which is to open the page, the assessment details page, which is where we've just come from. And we're going to send the assessment ID from the create a row action. And we're going to send the page parameter for the risk ID as well. That sums up the Add New Risk functionality. Pretty simple and straightforward, as the same as Add New Risk. So let's move on to Mitigation Plan Details page. We should now be familiar with these specific detail pages, and we can take a look at what's happening here. So for example, we're looking at Mitigation Plan Details, which means that we are getting the details from the plan details here. And we're going to be loading in all the data dynamically, starting with the description of the item, then loading in items from the status, and of course, from the due date. We then have similar functionality that we would expect to be having on these pages. We can then update the plan details from this details page by adding some events for updating a row and choosing the plan ID for the page parameter where it's coming from, and then adding in the data that we're updating through the form data within these elements. We then, of course, refresh that data source, and we can check that everything is working dynamically and is correct, again, by simply updating the record ID here and making sure that the details are changing, which we can see live here when there is an actual record that contains data behind it. This functionality should all be becoming a bit more familiar now, and we can tell that the last piece of information that we need to do and last actions we need to take in this application is to add a new mitigation. So let's take a look at the Add New Mitigation page. No surprises anymore. This is going to be a very similar functionality that we've already seen much of now throughout this application, where we have a form element and many items within that form element to choose the data that you want to create. So, of course, being a mitigation plan, we're going to need to give the data input for a title, the description, the due date, and then choose which status we want to add to that. We then, of course, are going to have the events to create a row, and it's going to come from the form data that we've just filled in. And then, just like the other ones, we're going to also follow up on that event by having an open page event and going to the previous page of mitigation plan details to show the record we've just created. So that is the entirety of our page setup for this application. Let's now take a look at how we can both preview and publish this application. There are two ways to look at our app. We can either preview or publish it. Preview is a way to keep this internally and only load the resources from an internal environment where you're logged into Baserow. And publish will externally publish this so that it's available on the World Wide Web, available to anyone with the URL to access it. Let's take a look at the preview functionality. And as we click this, we'll notice that we're actually getting an error saying authentication required. If you remember correctly, this is because we set up the page visibility settings as logged in visitors only. We did this for all the pages except for the login page, meaning that the login page is the only one we're able to access without being authenticated. In order to access this Add New Mitigation page, we're going to have to authenticate as one of the users. So we can do that by adding in the credentials in our login form and clicking Sign In. We'll see that we are logged in as Ali Ecker, and even our form data that is dynamically loading that data has also updated to show that the owner of this record is going to be Ali Ecker. Now, even though we're in a preview state of our app, if we actually create data inside here, it is actually going to create that data inside our database. And we can test that along with the functionality that we've created by adding a new record here. We see that we are taken to the next page, which is a mitigation plan details page for the record we just created. So the functionality inside our app is working as expected. And we can also double check that by going into our database, looking at our risk assessment, mitigation plans table, and seeing that new record has been created, saying test 2, and we can see that that is assigned to Ali Ecker. So the correct information is being added and everything seems to be working as intended. Just going to go ahead and delete that record while I'm here, as it's just a test record. And then we can move back to our mitigation plan page and look at our preview. Now, when we're previewing our app, we just want to make sure that all the fundamental aspects of our app, the functionality is all working as we expect. So now that we're logged in, we can just go around and click through some of the functionality. For example, I want to see if this regulatory non-compliance link is going to point me to the correct record. So when I click that, I can see that I am going to the registered risk detail page, and that record that I clicked is getting loaded in correctly. I can see that all the data seems to be getting loaded correctly dynamically, including the attached links for the risk assessments. and the mitigation plans attached to this report. We can then go ahead and click through one of those to see that that's taking us to the correct record on the assessment details page, which it seems to be doing. We can take that a step further and make sure that this is going to update to our risk assessment 1, and we can see that that has correctly happened. So the functionality of our app seems to be working as we expected. We can just continue to click through and make sure that the links are all pointing to the correct records. For example, this should take us to our legal dispute one, which has happened correctly too. Once we're happy with all of that, we can then start to look at how we're going to publish our app to an external domain name. When we get ready to publish our app, we can click the publish setting, and we're going to be taken to a publish modal window here. And we can see that the first action we need to take is have at least one domain in order to publish our application. Now, if you are on the self-hosted version, the only option you'll be given is the custom domain. This means that you will have to have a domain name that you control, where you can update the DNS settings to update the CNAME record in order to point to the correct domain. Now, on our SaaS hosted version of Baserow, you'll be able to select subdomain of baserow.site. So we're going to just go ahead with that option just for ease of use. And we can just now simply type in the name of the domain that we want to have. So we're going to just type risk assessment and mitigation. And although this is obviously a very long domain name, we just want to create this on .baserow.site. We can see that this is the correct URL of what we want to publish it to now. And as we click publish, that subdomain of baserow.site is going to get created for us, and the site is going to be automatically published there. Now we can click view site, and we'll note that we are getting taken to that domain name, and we are taken, of course, to our login form. Now, the reason why we're doing that, getting taken to that, is because this is obviously a new domain name, and therefore any credentials that we've used or cookies that are stored are not going to work inside this new one until we authenticate with it too. So we can now check that this is also working. So we'll add our Ali Ecker email and password and try to log in. I've entered in incorrect password there just to test that authentication is working as expected. And now we'll test the real password to make sure that is getting authorized correctly. And we can see that is the case. And we are now logged in as Ali Ecker. And now you can do the same thing by just clicking around inside the app to make sure that it is loading correctly as you'd expect, the same as you had done in the previous state. Now, once we've done that, we can be sure that our application is fully ready, and we can start to share that URL that we've published to that domain to anyone to access this application online.